Hello. If you're wondering where you are, you're following Grandma. I often start these podcasts by telling you what kind of a day it is here in Scotland. You see, I record in my study, and on one side of the room there's a window that faces south and looks out over the North Sea. When there's a gale, it's great to be safely inside looking out. But on days like today, when the sun shines and the sea sparkles, I know it's time to pull on a light sweater and head for the beach. I was looking out of this window earlier, and I saw a small boy with his dad heading down the cobbled street that leads to the steps up onto the harbour wall. They had that jaunty air of men who have a purpose. They both carried fishing rods, a box, no doubt full of bait, and small buckets into which they would put their catch of the day. I instantly had memories of fishing with my grandchildren, ponds, rivers, sea fishing trips, and fly fishing. As I watched this man and his son, I remembered an article I'd read recently. Angling is one of the most popular UK outdoor sports. Last year, over 1 million angling licences were bought and 20,000 people paid for tickets to the Big One fishing show in Farnborough. When you add on people who fish in places that don't require a licence, that's a huge number of people who go out every week. Often, on my cliff walks in icy, wintry conditions, I see men perched on precarious outcrops, maybe 30 feet below, with the sea breaking onto the rocks only feet away from them. When I meet these men on the cliff path, they're always full of bonhomie, whatever the conditions. So what is this secret ingredient that fishing holds? Obviously, more than catching a fish. What is so seductive about fishing? From the moment when the line goes taut and indicates a bite, to finally landing the beastie, there's often much high drama. If you're on a sea trip, it's astonishing to see dozens of mackerel being landed on the deck after they've seemingly voluntarily jumped onto the hooks. But even if you don't fish, if you've seen a wild salmon leaping high over rocks and boulders as it makes its annual journey to the head of the river, you'll never forget that breathtaking moment. Scotland and fishing are synonymous. Think lochs, think boats, think reels, think licences, think rivers and oceans, harbour walls and small ponds. That's Scotland and fishing. When my grandson Stan came to Scotland for his summer holidays, he was clear. He wanted to fish. I've flown kites, ridden horses, cycled and scuba dived. I might come from a family of fisherfolk, but I've never fished in my life. This new challenge required quick, smart thinking. We headed for hands-on advice from Arbroath's fishing tackle shop. Surrounded by the enthusiasm of other fishermen, we left triumphantly with the basic kit, suitable rods and reels, the right kind of hooks, and a small can of worms. Stan dreamt of mackerel, cod, bream, roach, rudd, perch, brown trout and salmon, and we hatched plans together. Part of the fun was deciding where to dip our rods. We sought out inexpensive, small, well-stocked ponds. Should we look in the Kingdom of Fife, Tayside or Perth? Apple Hill, Butterstone, Frandy or Orkill. I loved just reading the names, and at an average of £7 or £8 a day, we were spoiled for choice. Sound local knowledge came from the Arbroath fishing tackle shop. Try Geordie's Pond in Angus. We packed a lunch and plenty of suntan lotion and set off along the winding coastal road. On our way, we stopped at the old fishing village of Auchmithie. Centuries ago, this was an important Angus fishing community. It was built on the cliff top. To get down to the harbour, which is in ruins some 30 or more feet below, there's a very steep path. The harbour is surrounded by weather-beaten rocks and outcrops full of amazing bird life. One spring day, I was exploring the isolated rocky beach when I became aware of birds with bright orange feet whizzing past me into a cave in the cliff face. I did a double take. I realised they were puffins, and this was a breeding ground. That really was a wow moment. But Auchmithie had one tradition that still makes me curious. 100 years ago, when they were going out to fish, the men, accompanied by the women, would make their way down the rough path to the small harbour, and then the women would give them a piggyback and wade into the sea. There are old photos showing this. Why did they do that? The answer, to keep the men's feet dry, doesn't quite stack up, because they must have got wet once they were out at sea and the boat deck was awash with water. Anyway, that was just one of the jobs the women did after preparing the fishing lines with hundreds of mussels, then gutting and cleaning the fish when the men returned. Oh, maybe looking after the children and cooking tea for everyone. But it's an interesting tradition. The puffins had long gone from Auchmithie the day that Stan and I were there, but the harbour is still atmospheric, and we were able to make up stories about what life might have been like when it was a bustling fishing community. We decided this would be a good place to come back to at a later date for some easy sea fishing. We still had to find Geordie's pond, so we continued driving north along the coastal road. It was a warm summer day, and the fields on either side were ablaze with vivid yellow rape plants. They were dazzling. Rape is a part of the mustard family, and it's well known for being grown to produce cooking oil. However, I was fascinated to learn recently that it's used in soaps, as a lamp fuel, and is also a lubricant for jet engines. Apparently, birds love the seeds, but it's the colour of fields of rape plants that makes your heart sing. As we continued along the road, singing our family songs and looking out for fishing notices, we passed the signpost for Lunan Bay, which had another centuries-old tradition. Lunan Bay remains a very special place for me, and people who come to stay always put it top of their wish list. I remember the first time I visited, shortly after I came to live in Arbroath. Friends had talked about Lunan Bay, and I decided to go and see it for myself. What I encountered that particular day exceeded my expectations. I parked my car, climbed up the steep sand dunes. Suddenly, as I reached the top, the whole bay with its long, curved golden beach and tidal sea backdrop spread out below me. There were cliffs and caves in the distance and an incredible 360-degree sky overhead. I stood and simply breathed it all in for several minutes, and as I turned to look at the cliffs, I could see a tiny train crossing a bridge. It was actually the huge intercity train linking Aberdeen with London, but from this perspective it looked like a toy town train. Incidentally, if you're ever visiting Scotland, this is a spectacular journey from Aberdeen to Arbroath as the train gently meanders along the coastline, allowing you to soak up the landscape. I'd looked at a map beforehand, and I knew that historic Ethy Castle was hidden on the promontory at the south end. There's also a small artist colony close to the sea, and cottages dotted on the hillside near the ruined Red Castle, close to where the River Lunan makes its lazy entrance into the sea from the Angus Hills. The north end of the bay has towering cliffs, home to thousands of seabirds and wildlife, and in between are Humpty Dumpty-like sand dunes running along the beach. My first impression was that Lunan Bay was everything that people had described, and more. But on this particular day, something was happening in the water. As I looked down from the dunes, I could see men in bright yellow clothing picking large shapes out of the sea, and there was also a small tractor buzzing up and down the beach. I scrambled down the rough sand dunes to find out what was going on, and discovered I was watching the centuries-old way of catching wild salmon in nets, a tradition that's been passed down in families from generation to generation. Nets had been set up in the sea on posts, rather like football goal posts. As the tide came in, the salmon had swum towards the shore, and then as the sea went out, they were caught in the backs of the anchored nets. Solitary fishermen clad in yellow waterproofs and salopettes were wading up to their chests in the cold North Sea, retrieving the still thrashing salmon. The fish scales flashed in the sunlight, and I moved closer and watched the men wrestling with these huge wild fish. Each one was then wrapped securely in their arms, carried from the sea, and deposited in the small tank attached to the back of the tractor. What a privilege to have seen this ancient tradition and observed the skill, patience, and fortitude of the fishermen involved. It was a bitter cold day, and I certainly wouldn't have wanted to paddle, and definitely wouldn't have wanted to wrestle with a huge fish. Shortly after this, a law was introduced that prohibited the use of nets in order to improve the wild salmon stock. That must have been a blow for the fishermen, and given the dedication and passion with which they worked that day, it must have also been heartbreaking. Now only the small stumps of the posts are visible at low tide, but they are still visible. It struck me there might be something to learn from this fishing cameo. We see and hear so many people complaining about the way life has changed and it not being like it was in the old days. It's worth reflecting on change, because if we just complain about it, we can often miss the benefits that it can bring. Some change is difficult and doesn't make things better. But other change is an inevitable part of life. We can't stop it happening. It's part of the cycle of life and death, and is necessary in order for new life to develop. Whilst no doubt this particular change was hard and uncomfortable for the fishermen and business, it has possibly had some benefits for the fish and regeneration of salmon stock. Those remaining visible fishing net stumps remind me that when we experience change, it's important to ensure our values and standards still remain visible, even after the change has happened. Perhaps some of what we've all gone through recently is like the regeneration of the salmon. Sometimes a period of absence or cutting back is necessary. The important thing is to remember what we had to let go, and to be open to what comes next. As long as we can see our solid stumps, we keep alive what we valued, and by communicating our stories, we can help to build a stronger future. Who knows, one day they might revive this art of salmon fishing. Stan and I rounded a corner. Smiley fish road signs and arrows indicated a turning to Geordie's Pond. We were close to our destination, where the fish were, unknowingly, awaiting our arrival. As we drove in, Geordie, a man in his 80s, arrived on his tractor, welcomed us, showed us where to sign in, where to find the coffee and tea in the angler's shed as well. Geordie had a passion for digging holes, and also for fish. So, when he retired, it was obvious that creating large ponds on his land and stocking them with shoals of fish was the answer to what he'd do next. Geordie drove off to do more digging, and we found a nice, shady spot and settled down to experience the art of fishing. My first impression of the other fishermen was of generosity, enthusiasm, and great advice. Stan lapped it up. It was men's talk. I sat back and relaxed. From help with threading the line through the rod to choosing the right bait, how to cast, how to reel in, the men were patient and generous. As the sun moved westwards, there was still no catch. There were many moments when it looked like Stan had a bite. One or two fish got away with the bait, and still he fished. As the dusk fell, there was a tug on his line. Yes, it was the one that didn't get away, a nice-sized trout. I have a photo of him and his fish. It brings back all the emotions of that day. We had laughed and cried at some of the silly and funny moments that only a fishing line and a woolly hat can produce. But fishing was more than a gentle way of spending the day. It was full of sharing and conversation. These were not men simply sitting by a pond. There was a deep current of activity flowing through their seeming idleness. They were responding to whatever needed to be done, whether it was adjusting lines, retying hooks, or casting into deeper, darker waters, and hoping. My grandson was exposed to people who had respect for each other and for nature. He too remained hopeful, dedicated, and continued to learn from his mistakes. I watched as he absorbed some of their values: perseverance, acceptance, generosity, and optimism. We can't all go fishing, but we can put some of these values back into our lives. They are valuable supports that we all need, particularly in periods of change. So maybe today you'll have more patience with a friend, begin to accept a difficult situation, or simply remain open to the possibility of change. I began to understand the deeper attraction of fishing.